The distant thunder of hooves echoed across the parched Montana plains as Dalton Morgan raced toward the horizon, where billowing black smoke stained the clear blue sky of 1876. His heart pounded harder than his stallion's hooves against the hard-packed earth, a terrible knowing already settling in his gut. The fire was coming from the direction of his ranch, everything he had spent the last 7 years building. "Faster, thunder," he urged, leaning low over his horse's neck, the wind whipping his face as they crested the final ridge. What awaited him crushed whatever hope he had been clinging to. The small valley that cradled his homestead was transformed into a hellscape. His modest but prideful 2-story ranch house, the barn where he'd birthed countless calves, the corral where he'd broken wild mustangs, all were consumed by relentless flames. In the distance, he could see figures running, neighbors from miles around forming a desperate bucket line from the creek, but their efforts seemed futile against the inferno's hunger. Dalton spurred thunder down the slope, the horse's nostrils flaring at the scent of smoke and danger. As he approached, the heat hit him like a wall. His eyes watered and lungs burned, but he kept riding, searching desperately for his ranch hands. "Boss." Old Pete, his foreman, broke away from the line, his weathered face streaked with soot and sweat. "Thank God you're here." "What happened?" Dalton demanded, dismounting in one fluid motion. Lightning struck the hay storage. Wind picked up and... Pete gestured hopelessly at the destruction. "We got all the horses out, most of the cattle scattered, but the buildings, there was no stopping it." Dalton stood motionless, watching as 7 years of back-breaking work, the dreams that had carried him west from St. Louis after the war, disappeared into ash and embers. The ranch had been everything: his purpose, his future, the legacy he'd hoped to build. Now it was nothing but a smoldering reminder of how quickly fate could strip a man bare. "The ledgers? The cash box?" Dalton asked, his voice hollow. Pete's silence was answer enough. That night, Dalton made camp under the stars, refusing offers of shelter from neighbors. He sat alone by a small fire, irony not lost on him, staring into the flames as if they might offer answers. His cattle were scattered across miles of rangeland, his savings reduced to cinders, his home gone. At 32, Dalton Morgan found himself exactly where he'd been when he first arrived in Montana territory, with nothing but a horse, a saddle, and the clothes on his back. Sleep refused to come. As dawn broke, Dalton mounted Thunder and rode the perimeter of his property, surveying the devastation in harsh morning light. The blackened skeletons of buildings stood like tombstones, marking the death of his dreams. The only structure partially standing was the stone chimney of the main house, defiant against the destruction. Dalton dismounted and walked through the ruins, boots crunching on charred debris. Occasionally, he stooped to pick up remnants: a melted belt buckle, the iron head of a hammer, a handful of nails that might still be usable. His movements were mechanical, his face an expressionless mask that hid the turmoil within. As midday approached, the sound of an approaching wagon drew his attention. Straightening up, hand instinctively moving to the revolver on his hip, Dalton turned to see a wagon rolling toward what remained of his home. The driver was a woman, her honey blonde hair visible beneath a practical straw hat. As she drew closer, he recognized Clara Abernathy, whose father owned the general store in Sweetwater, the nearest town some 15 miles distant. Clara pulled her wagon to a stop and set the brake before climbing down. She was dressed practically in a blue calico dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. At 26, Clara was known throughout the county for her no-nonsense approach to life and her kindness, a kindness Dalton wasn't sure he could face right now. "Mr. Morgan," she greeted, her voice as warm as the summer day. "I came as soon as I heard." Dalton nodded stiffly. "Miss Abernathy." "I brought supplies," she continued, gesturing to the wagon bed behind her. "Food, some tools, blankets." Dad sent credit for whatever else you might need from the store. I appreciate the thought, Dalton said, his pride struggling with necessity, but I'm not looking for charity. Clara's green eyes flashed with something that might have been irritation. It's not charity, Mr. Morgan. It's neighborliness. You'd do the same for any of us. She was right, of course. When the Wilsons lost their crop to locusts last season, Dalton had been first to offer help. When influenza swept through Sweetwater last winter, he'd ridden through blizzards delivering medicine. But accepting help was another matter entirely. Besides, Clara added, pulling a basket from the wagon, you have to eat. And I doubt you've had anything since yesterday. The aroma of fresh bread and roast chicken wafted from the basket, reminding Dalton's stomach that it had indeed been empty for far too long. With a grudging nod, he accepted her offering. They sat together on a flat stone near the chimney, sharing the meal in silence. Dalton ate mechanically at first, then with increasing hunger as his body demanded sustenance. Clara didn't press him to talk, and for that he was grateful. I'm heading to my brother's place in Oregon, Dalton finally said, breaking the silence. Not much left for me here. Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Is that what you want? To leave? The question struck him as odd. Want's got nothing to do with it. This land's been in my family for generations. Everything I had went into building this place, and now it's gone. The land's still here, she observed quietly. The soil didn't burn. Dalton gave a bitter laugh. And what am I supposed to do? Start over with nothing? I'm not a young man anymore, Miss Abernathy. 32 is hardly ancient, Mr. Morgan, she replied with a hint of amusement. Then her expression grew serious. My father always says the measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in rising every time they fall. Wise words, Dalton acknowledged. But some falls break a man. Clara stood then, brushing crumbs from her skirt. Only if he lets them. She looked around at the devastation, then back to him. The community is gathering tomorrow to help clear the debris. They'll be here at first light. I told you. I know what you told me, she interrupted firmly. And they're coming anyway. That's what neighbors do, Mr. Morgan, whether the recipient is gracious about it or not. With that, she returned to her wagon, leaving the basket of remaining food beside him. Before climbing up to the driver's seat, she paused, looking back at the lonely figure amid the ruins. This doesn't have to be the end of your story here, you know, she said softly. Just a difficult chapter. Dalton watched her drive away, her words echoing in his mind long after the wagon disappeared from view. He spent the afternoon salvaging what he could, setting up a makeshift camp near the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property. As twilight fell, he sat by another small fire, contemplating the crossroads before him. Oregon meant starting fresh, anonymously, away from the memories of failure that would haunt him here. But leaving meant surrendering, and surrender had never been in Dalton Morgan's nature, not even during the darkest days of the war. The next morning, true to Clara's word, wagons began arriving before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains. Men with shovels and picks, women with baskets of food, even children ready to collect nails and other small items that could be salvaged. Dalton watched from his campsite, a complex mix of emotions churning within him. Old Pete was first to approach him. You gonna sit there brooding all day? Or help us clear your land? The foreman asked bluntly. Dalton looked past him to the gathering crowd. There were the Hendersons, who ran the competing ranch to the north, the Jacobsons, whose daughter he'd taught to ride, Reverend Taylor and his wife, and dozens of others people he'd known, worked with, occasionally quarreled with, but who had all come together now. And at the center of it all, directing traffic and assigning tasks with the efficiency of a military commander, was Clara Abernathy. With a deep breath, Dalton set aside his coffee cup and stood. Got an extra shovel, Pete? The older man grinned. That's more like it. The work was backbreaking but somehow healing. By midday, the main house area was cleared of debris, revealing the stone foundation largely intact. The barn area was next, with men working together to clear heavy, charred beams. Women had set up a food station near the creek, where the shade offered respite from the summer heat. During a brief break, Dalton found himself beside Clara as she distributed water to the workers.
"Thank you," he said simply, "for all of this."
Clara handed him a tin cup of cool water. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Morgan. This is just the beginning." "Dalton," he corrected. "If you're going to bulldoze your way into rebuilding my life, you might as well use my Christian name." Her lips quirked in a smile that transformed her practical features into something that caught Dalton unexpectedly off guard. "Clara, then." For 3 days, the community worked together to clear the ruins. On the 4th morning, fewer wagons arrived, as most had to return to their own responsibilities. But Clara was there each day, bringing not only food but also ledgers and pencils, sketching rough plans for rebuilding as they worked. "The barn should be the priority," she explained one evening as they sat by the fire. "Winter will be here before you know it, and your cattle will need shelter. The house can wait." Dalton studied her in the firelight. "You seem mighty invested in my rebuilding plans." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Someone has to be. You've been too busy feeling sorry for yourself." "I have not been," he began indignantly, then stopped to her knowing look.
"Fine.
"Maybe I have been." "It's understandable," she conceded, "but not productive." "And productivity is important to you, isn't it?" he observed. Clara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a rare gesture of self-consciousness. "When my mother died 5 years ago, I took over running the household for my father, then helping at the store. There's always work to be done." "And no time for yourself?" "This is for myself," she replied softly, gesturing to the plans spread between them. "I enjoy solving problems, creating order from chaos. It gives me purpose." Dalton considered her words, seeing Clara in a new light. Perhaps they were more alike than he'd realized, both seeking meaning through work, through building something tangible in a world that often seemed determined to take rather than give. As days turned into weeks, a rhythm developed. Dalton worked from dawn until dusk, rebuilding first a small shelter, then beginning the framework for a new barn. Clara came 3 times a week, bringing supplies, helping with the books as Dalton began the slow process of recovering his scattered herd, and often staying to work alongside him. They talked as they worked about everything and nothing. Dalton shared stories of his time in the Union Army, of coming west with nothing but determination. Clara spoke of her dreams of expanding her father's store, of the books she read late into the night, of her secret wish to one day see the ocean. One particularly hot afternoon in late July, they were raising support beams for the barn when thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. Both looked up to see dark clouds gathering with alarming speed. "We need to secure what we can," Dalton said urgently. "This storm's coming fast." They worked frantically, tying down loose materials and covering the more delicate supplies with tarpaulins. The wind picked up, whipping Clara's skirts and loosening her hair from its practical bun. Rain began to fall, fat drops that quickly became a torrential downpour. "The wagon!" Clara shouted over the wind, pointing to where her horse was growing restless in the face of the storm. Together they ran to unhitch the nervous animal, leading it to the half-built shelter where Thunder was already seeking refuge. By the time they joined the horses, both were soaked to the skin, Clara's hair plastered to her face, Dalton's shirt clinging to his shoulders. In the close confines of the shelter, with rain drumming on the roof and thunder crashing overhead, they stood facing each other, breathing hard from the exertion. A drop of rain traced a path down Clara's cheek, and without thinking, Dalton reached out to brush it away. His fingers lingered against her skin, the unexpected softness contrasting with the roughness of his calloused hand. Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had acknowledged until now. Then lightning flashed, illuminating the shelter in stark white light, breaking the spell. Dalton dropped his hand and stepped back. "You should stay until the storm passes," he said, his voice rough. Clara nodded, turning to stroke Thunder's neck, but not before Dalton caught the flush spreading across her cheeks. The storm lasted well into evening, forcing them to share a simple meal of beans and bacon cooked over a small fire at the mouth of the shelter. Their conversation was stilted at first, both acutely aware of the shift in the air between them, but gradually eased back into familiarity as they discussed the progress of the rebuilding. "We should be able to complete the barn frame by month's end," Dalton was saying as the rain finally began to slacken. "Then we—" Clara interrupted, a small smile playing at her lips. Dalton paused, realizing what he'd said. He corrected. "I should be able to complete it." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You were right the first time. We." Something warm unfurled in Dalton's chest at her words. After nearly 2 months of working side by side, Clara had become more than a helper or even a friend. She had become essential to his days, her visits the moments he looked forward to most. "We then," he agreed softly. As August melted into September, the new barn took shape, sturdier and larger than the one that had burned. The cattle herd was slowly growing again, as strays were found and brought back, and neighboring ranchers generously offered calves and heifers to help rebuild his stock. Dalton had begun laying the foundation for a new house as well, simpler than before, but designed with care. Clara continued to visit regularly, her presence, now, an expected part of Dalton's life. They had settled into an easy partnership, working together with a synchronicity that didn't require words. Yet beneath this comfortable rhythm ran an undercurrent of unspoken feeling that grew stronger with each passing day. One crisp September afternoon, Clara arrived to find Dalton setting fence posts along the northern boundary of his property. She hitched her wagon and walked across the field to join him, a wicker basket over her arm. "You're a day early," Dalton observed, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his brow. "Father had business in Silver Creek, so I thought I'd surprise you," she explained, setting down the basket. "I brought apple pie. Mrs. Johnson had extra from yesterday's church social." Dalton grinned. "Now, that's a surprise worth having." They sat together on a fallen log, sharing the pie and watching as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. "I've been thinking," Clara said finally, her eyes still on the horizon. "A dangerous pastime," Dalton teased. She smiled but continued, "I've been thinking about what happens when winter comes." Dalton's smile faded. "The barn will be finished well before the first snow. The house, well, I can manage with the shelter until spring if needed." "That's not what I meant," Clara replied, turning to face him. "I meant these visits. The roads get bad in winter. There will be days, maybe weeks, when I won't be able to come." The thought sent an unexpected pang through Dalton's chest. The idea of not seeing Clara, not working alongside her, not sharing the quiet moments that had become the bedrock of his days, was surprisingly painful. "I suppose that's true," he acknowledged, trying to keep his voice casual. "Though I've been known to make it to town in some pretty bad weather." "Is that what you want?" Clara asked, her voice softening. "To come to town to see me?" Dalton looked at her then, really looked at her. The setting sun caught in her honey blonde hair, turning it to spun gold. Her green eyes, always so direct and clear, held a question that had been building between them for months. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly what I want." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out and took his hand, her smaller one fitting perfectly within his calloused palm. "What if," she began hesitantly, What if there was another solution? Dalton's heart began to beat faster. I'm listening. My father has been saying the store needs a man's help with the heavier work, she said, the words coming quickly now. And I find that I've grown rather attached to this valley, to this ranch. She paused, gathering courage.
To you.
The world seemed to still around them, the only sound the pounding of Dalton's heart in his ears. Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion, are you asking to court me proper? A smile bloomed across her face, bright as sunrise. I believe I am, Mr. Morgan. Though it seems we've been doing just that these past months without naming it. Dalton laughed then, a sound of pure joy that startled a nearby meadowlark into flight. We have it that, haven't we? He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I would be honored to court you, Clara Abernathy. Though I have to warn you, I'm still a man rebuilding from ashes. Then it's fortunate, she replied, her eyes shining, that I happen to be quite good at building things. With winter approaching, their courtship took on an urgency born of practical concerns as much as deepening feelings. The barn was completed by early October, a sturdy structure that would house both livestock and hay through the coming cold months. The house foundation was laid, and walls were beginning to rise. Clara was a frequent presence now, often staying from morning until dusk, helping with the building and bringing touches of home curtains salvaged from her mother's trunks, dishes from the store's stock, a handmade quilt for the single bed in Dalton's shelter. Their courtship was conducted largely in the open air of the rebuilding ranch, observed and gently teased by the remaining workers and occasional visitors. Old Pete, who had stayed on despite Dalton's initial insistence that he couldn't afford to pay him, watched their growing closeness with approval. About time you found someone to keep you honest, the foreman commented one evening as they finished securing the livestock. That girl's got more sense than most men I know. Dalton couldn't argue with that assessment. Clara's practical intelligence and unwavering determination had been instrumental in the ranch's rebirth. What had begun as neighborly kindness had evolved into a partnership that seemed, to Dalton, as essential as air. As October waned, the first snow flurries danced across the plains, a harbinger of the harsh Montana winter to come. The house was enclosed, but far from finished inside. Clara arrived one morning with her father, William Abernathy, a stout man with kind eyes and a businessman's shrewd assessment. Impressive work, William commented as Dalton showed them the progress. You've accomplished more in 3 months than most men could in a year. I've had help, Dalton replied, his eyes meeting Clara's. William nodded, understanding passing between the men. That's what I've come to discuss, actually. Clara tells me you two have been courting. Dalton straightened his shoulders. Yes, sir. With honorable intentions. I'd expect nothing less, William replied. But I'm concerned about my daughter traveling these roads once winter truly sets in. Last year we had drifts taller than a man. Father has a proposal, Clara interjected, her expression both nervous and hopeful. William cleared his throat. We have rooms above the store. Clara's idea is that you might consider wintering in town. You could help with the store, keep an eye on your cattle with regular rides out when weather permits, and continue your courtship without risking my daughter's neck on icy roads. Dalton's first instinct was to refuse. The ranch was his responsibility. He couldn't abandon it. But as he looked at the unfinished house, considered the brutal Montana winter approaching, and thought of not seeing Clara for weeks at a time, he found his resistance weakening. It's a generous offer, he acknowledged. But my place is here. Is it? Clara challenged softly. Or is your place with the people who matter to you? Her words struck home, forcing Dalton to confront the truth of the past months. Yes, rebuilding the ranch had been about reclaiming what was lost, proving he could rise from the ashes. But it had also become about building something new, a future that, increasingly, he couldn't imagine without Clara in it. I need to make arrangements for the livestock, he said finally. And I'd insist on paying fair rent for the room. William waved a hand dismissively. We can discuss the details later. But I think it's a sensible solution for all concerned. As William returned to the wagon to give them a moment alone, Clara approached Dalton, her eyes searching his face. "Are you certain?" she asked. "I know how important being here is to you." Dalton took her hands in his, marveling as always at how they fit together. "What's important is what we're building together, Clara. Not just these walls and beams, but something stronger." A smile bloomed across her face, and she rose on tiptoes to press a quick, daring kiss to his cheek. Then it settled. "You'll come to town when the first big snow arrives." The first substantial snowfall came in mid-November, blanketing the valley in pristine white. As agreed, Dalton secured the ranch as best he could, leaving the cattle in Pete's capable hands, and rode Thunder into Sweetwater with a small trunk of possessions. The Abernathy General Store was the heart of Sweetwater, a two-story building on the town's main street. The upper floor contained the family's living quarters plus 2 additional rooms originally intended for William's sons, both of whom had moved east years ago. Dalton was given the larger of these rooms, a comfortable space with a window overlooking the street. Winter in town was a new experience for Dalton. Used to the isolation of ranch life, he initially found the constant presence of townspeople somewhat overwhelming. But he quickly adapted, falling into a routine of helping William with the store during the day, riding out to check the ranch whenever weather permitted, and spending evenings with Clara and her father. These evening hours became precious to Dalton and Clara. After supper, William would often retire to his study with his ledgers, leaving the couple in the parlor. There, before a crackling fire, they would talk, read to each other from Clara's collection of books, or simply sit in companionable silence, her sewing in her lap, him whittling or sketching plans for spring improvements to the ranch. It was during one such evening in early December that Dalton first realized the depth of his feelings. Clara was reading aloud from Tennyson, her voice soft in the firelit room, when she paused to look up at him. "Are you listening at all?" she asked with mock severity. To every word, he assured her, though in truth, he had been watching the way the firelight played across her features, how it turned her hair to liquid gold and warmed her skin to honey. "Then what did I just read?" she challenged, a smile tugging at her lips. Dalton leaned forward, taking the book gently from her hands. Their fingers brushed, sending that now familiar warmth through his veins. "Something about love, I imagine," he said, his voice low. "Though Tennyson couldn't possibly capture what I feel when I look at you." Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching. They had been cautious in their courtship, mindful of propriety and William's presence. But in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of feelings too powerful to be contained by conventional restraint. "Dalton," she whispered, his name a question and answer all at once. He set the book aside and took her hands in his. "I love you, Clara Abernathy. I think I've loved you since the day you drove that wagon onto my burned-out ranch and refused to let me wallow in self-pity." Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "And I've loved you since I watched you stand among those ashes and refuse to be defeated by them." Dalton brought her hands to his lips, pressing fervent kisses to her knuckles. "I have nothing to offer you but a half-built ranch and a heart that's yours entirely." "That," Clara replied, "is everything I could ever want." The next morning, Dalton spoke with William, formally asking for permission to marry his daughter. The older man regarded him thoughtfully for a long moment before breaking into a smile. "You've proven yourself a man of character and determination, Dalton," William said, extending his hand. "I would be proud to call you son." Christmas in Sweetwater was a community affair, with the church hosting a celebration that brought together families from miles around. Dalton, who had spent the last several holidays alone on his ranch, found himself swept up in the festivities. The general store closed early on Christmas Eve, and the Abernathys, with Dalton in tow, attended the evening service. The small church was transformed by candlelight and evergreen boughs, the scent of pine mingling with beeswax. Clara sat between her father and Dalton, her hand tucked into the crook of Dalton's arm, her face alight with joy as the congregation sang carols. Reverend Taylor gave a sermon about rebirth and renewal, words that resonated deeply with Dalton. When the service concluded, they emerged to find that fresh snow had begun to fall, large flakes drifting lazily from the night sky. As they walked back to the store, William discreetly dropped behind, allowing the young couple a moment of privacy. "I have something for you," Dalton said, reaching into his coat pocket. "It's not much, but—" He pressed a small wooden box into Clara's gloved hand. She opened it carefully to reveal a simple gold band set with a single small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "The only thing I had of hers that survived the fire. I kept it in my saddlebag." Clara looked up at him, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Clara Abernathy," Dalton said, taking the ring from the box and holding it between them, "would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Not just for the convenience of winter arrangements, but for all seasons to come." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Dalton Morgan. I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger over her glove, promising to place it properly once they were inside. Then, mindful of propriety even as joy threatened to burst his heart, he pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead. The winter passed in a blur of preparations. They set a wedding date for the first day of spring, when travel would be easier for guests and the ranch would be ready for their return. Dalton rode out whenever the weather allowed, working on the house with renewed purpose. Each nail driven, each board placed, was no longer just rebuilding what was lost, it was creating a home for the future he and Clara would share. In town, Clara sewed her wedding dress with help from the ladies of Sweetwater, while Dalton ordered furniture from a craftsman in Silver Creek. William, ever practical, gifted them with household necessities from the store stock, while neighbors and friends contributed everything from preserved foods to handcrafted items for their new home. February brought a particularly severe blizzard that kept Dalton in town for nearly 2 weeks. Stir-crazy from confinement, he paced the store like a caged animal until Clara suggested he put his energy to better use. "We have that back storeroom that needs organizing," she pointed out. "And Father's been wanting new shelves built for the dry goods section." Grateful for the occupation, Dalton threw himself into improving the store. Working alongside William during the day and Clara in the evenings, he gained a new appreciation for the business that had been her world. He came to understand her pride in the store, her knowledge of its operations, and her vision for its future. One evening, as they sat together reviewing inventory lists, Dalton broached a subject that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about the store," he began cautiously. Clara looked up, curiosity in her eyes. "Oh, your father isn't getting any younger," Dalton continued. "And running both the ranch and helping here, well, it would be a lot." "What are you suggesting?" Clara asked, setting aside her pencil. "What if we split our time? Summers at the ranch, winters here in town. Your father keeps the books, you and I manage the day-to-day operations during winter, and we hire more help for the ranch during summer." Clara's eyes widened as she considered the proposal. "You'd be willing to do that? Spend half the year away from the ranch?" "I'd be with you," Dalton replied simply. "That's what matters. And the truth is, I've come to enjoy the work here. It's different from ranching, but it has its own satisfactions." Clara's face softened with love. "You continue to surprise me, Dalton Morgan." "I hope to do so for the rest of our lives," he promised. The proposal was presented to William the next day and met with enthusiastic approval. Plans were made, adjustments considered, and by the time the snow began to melt in early March, a new future had been mapped out for the Morgan Abernathy enterprise. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the first true day of spring 1877. Sweetwater's small church was filled to capacity, with guests spilling out onto the steps. Old Pete stood as Dalton's best man, cleaned up so thoroughly that several town ladies failed to recognize him at first. Clara's childhood friend Emma served as her maid of honor. When Clara appeared on her father's arm, Dalton felt the world stop around him. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons down the back that matched the ring on her finger. Her honey blonde hair was swept up beneath a lace veil, a few tendrils escaping to frame her face. The ceremony passed in a blur for Dalton, his focus entirely on the woman before him. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love, honor, and cherish Clara for all his days. When Reverend Taylor pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton gathered her gently in his arms for their first kiss as a married couple, the cheers of the congregation washing over them like a benediction. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with tables set up in the town square and everyone contributing to the feast. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes, until finally, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the newlyweds slipped away. William had insisted they take his wagon, decorated with ribbons and flowers by the town's children, for the journey to the ranch. As Dalton helped Clara up onto the seat, her wedding dress carefully arranged around her, he couldn't resist stealing another kiss. "Ready, Mrs. Morgan?" he asked, his heart full to bursting with love and pride. "I've been ready since the day I found you standing in those ashes," she replied, her eyes shining in the gathering dusk. The journey to the ranch was made in companionable silence, broken only by occasional observations about the stars or the softness of the spring air. As they crested the final ridge, the ranch came into view, transformed from the burned-out shell Dalton had found nearly a year before. The new house stood tall and proud, larger than the original, but built with the same care. Lamplight shone from the windows Pete's doing, ensuring the place would be warm and welcoming for their arrival. The barn, corral, and outbuildings formed a tidy complex around the main house, with new fencing extending across the pastures. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed as Dalton brought the wagon to a stop before the house. "It's home," he replied, taking her hand. "Our home." Before she could move to climb down, Dalton circled the wagon and lifted her into his arms, her wedding dress billowing around them. "I believe this is traditional," he said with a grin, carrying her up the steps and across the threshold. Inside, the house was simply but comfortably furnished, the main room dominated by a large stone fireplace where a welcoming blaze crackled. Clara's touches were evident everywhere: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the rocking chair, wildflowers arranged in a pottery vase on the table. "When did you do all this?" she asked in wonder as he set her gently on her feet. "I had help," Dalton admitted. The women of Sweetwater are remarkably good at keeping secrets from their future postmistress. Clara laughed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "It's perfect, Dalton. Absolutely perfect." He stepped close, drawing her into his arms. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, when I was standing among the ruins?" Clara's eyes softened with memory. "I said many things that day. I was rather determined to pull you out of your despair." "You took my hand," Dalton continued, lacing his fingers with hers now, "and you said, 'We'll build again.' Not you will, but we will." As if it was already decided that we would do it together. "I think perhaps it was," she replied softly, "decided by something larger than either of us." Dalton brought her hand to his heart. "Everything I am now, everything I have, is because you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. You saw possibility where I saw only ruin. And look what we've built," Clara whispered, her free hand reaching up to cup his cheek. "Not just a ranch or a business, but a life. Our life." As the fire crackled and stars shone through the windows of their new home, Dalton Morgan bent to kiss his bride, grateful beyond words for the woman who had found him at his lowest moment and offered not pity, but partnership. The woman who had taken his hand amid the ashes of his former life and, with quiet confidence, promised they would build again. And build they had a home, a business, a love that would stand against whatever storms the future might bring. Together, they had discovered that sometimes, from the greatest loss comes the most precious gain. That endings can become beginnings. That with love, faith, and determination, what rises from the ashes can be stronger, more beautiful, and more meaningful than what came before. In the years that followed, Dalton and Clara Morgan would face their share of challenges: harsh winters, difficult calving seasons, economic downturns that affected both ranch and store. But they faced each one together, their partnership strengthening with every obstacle overcome. By their 5th anniversary in 1882, their enterprises had expanded considerably. The ranch now boasted one of the finest herds in the county, while Abernathy and Morgan General Store had doubled in size, adding a post office that Clara managed with characteristic efficiency. Their winter residence above the store had been renovated to accommodate their growing family twin boys, William and Robert, born in their 2nd year of marriage, followed by daughter Elizabeth the year after. On the anniversary of the fire that had nearly broken him, Dalton often stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and remembering the desolation he had felt that day. Then invariably, Clara would join him, slipping her hand into his with the same quiet confidence she had shown from the beginning. "What are you thinking about?" she would ask, though she already knew. And Dalton would pull her close, pressing a kiss to her temple before answering, "How fortunate I am that you found me in those ashes." Clara would smile up at him, her green eyes reflecting the same love that had sustained them through all the years of building. "I didn't just find you, Dalton Morgan. We found each other." In the firelight of their home, surrounded by the sounds of their children's laughter and the evidence of all they had built together, Dalton knew with absolute certainty that Clara was right. The greatest gift from the ashes of his former life hadn't been the rebuilt ranch or the thriving business, it had been the love of a woman who saw beyond the ruins to the possibilities that lay ahead. Together, they had built not just buildings and businesses, but a legacy of love, perseverance, and unwavering faith in each other that would endure long after they were gone. And in the end, that was the most precious thing of all.